Audio check.
Hey, good morning and welcome to docket number 24-1205. We're here for a technical meeting in PURA's procedural review of our annual RAM process. So we have an agenda in front of us today. Presentations from both Eversource and UI, followed by a roundtable discussion. I think we're all looking forward to that discussion. If you were paying attention to the agenda, we have not carved out a lunch break. We think we might be able to wrap by 1 p.m. if we go straight through with a short break midway through. So we'll play that by ear and see how that goes. But that is the general plan for today. Mr. Kramer, any opening remarks that I'm forgetting?
Thank you, Chairman Gillette, and thank you, commissioners. I'm just going to elaborate a little bit more on the plan that the chairman set out for the meeting. So good morning. My name is Peter Kramer with Authority staff. And first, I'd like to highlight just that our objective here is to discuss the proposed process modifications to the rate adjustment mechanism, or RAM, annual process, and a few housekeeping items to set the stage for our roundtable discussion. First, the meeting is being broadcast live on PURA's YouTube channel, and the recording of the live stream can be found there after the meeting. And we're also joined today by a court reporter who is producing a transcript of the meeting, and that will be available on PURA's website in the docket information section when available. For our participants today, the microphones, please ensure your microphone is on. The little green light will tell you that it is on, and speak into the mic so that both in-person and remote attendees can hear you. And when you do so, for our virtual participants, if you could please state your name and affiliation each time so that folks know who's speaking. And furthermore, for the roundtable representatives, these are the folks that are seated here at the tables in the front of the room. And as indicated in the notice of tech meeting, the identified representatives are the main participants in the roundtable discussion today. However, other members of the in-person audience may confer or may be recognized to speak by approaching the podium. If a roundtable representative would like to confer with someone in the audience, please just step away, have your conversation, and return as our meeting will proceed during your side conversation. And for anyone who'd like to be recognized to speak, as I said, just come up to the podium and we'll find a moment to recognize you and have you contribute to the discussion. As the chairman mentioned, we are planning to push through the agenda in favor of completing our agenda timely for a 1 o'clock adjournment. We'll look to squeeze in a break as we can, but I think everyone here has some good technical meeting stamina and can hang with us for the time, so thank you. Finally, for the discussion format, so we'll begin with the presentations from United Illuminating and from Eversource Energy in response to a handful of prompts that the authority issued, and then we'll move into the roundtable discussion portion of the meeting where authority staff, myself, and Mr. Norton will facilitate the discussion. We've listed the 4 discussion topics on the meeting agenda, and we'll move through each with a series of questions initiated by authority staff. However, participants are free to ask questions of one another in order to further develop the concepts and ideas that have been put forward to date in the proceedings discovery process. So please avail yourselves of the opportunity to ask questions of the other participants and help flesh out these ideas. And with that, I think we're ready for introductions. So I'll ask our participants, starting with you, Mr. Horton, to introduce your name and affiliation, please, and we'll go around the horseshoe here.
Good morning. I'm Doug Horton with Eversource.
Good morning. Marissa Pruda with Eversource Energy, Director of Revenue Requirements.
Morning, Mark Olga, Manager of Pricing at UI.
Good morning, Heather Tebbetts, Director of Regulatory for UI.
Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel.
Good morning, Ben Havamaki with Synapse Energy Economics, Consultant to the Office of Consumer Counsel.
Very good. Thank you all and welcome. Let's then get started with our first presentation, which is from Eversource.
Good morning. Marissa Pruda, Director of Revenue Requirements. In the essence of time, I will move as quickly as possible as I can because a lot of the information that we have put on the slides were already within our written comments and on the record. But in the first prompt related to the tech session that the participants and the EDCs were requested to provide some information, it was a proposal on the updated process and timing for annual RAM proceedings. So we have been proposing to evaluate the RAM process as it currently stands and look to moving certain material costs that tend to be highly volatile to a period of a rate change of January 1 and July 1, which essentially aligns with the RAM proceeding that used to be in place at one time around the 2020 timeframe before the pandemic and the rate spikes that we saw during the summer of 2020. We also propose that in doing so, not just to set and forget the rates on January 1 and July 1, but to have what we propose to be a 2-part test. The first part of the test would be to identify, once we have a base case cost in the rate setting and the rate is approved, after that rate and that cast-off rate, to be able to evaluate the actual costs as they are coming through the rate RAM components, particularly related to Millstone and Seabrook PPAs, and be able to present to PURA anytime within that evaluation on a monthly basis where those costs exceed 5% of the base case costs that were approved and included in the rate setting. But also the second part to that test is if it is greater than 1% of the total bill impact for the residential rate 1 customer. So that would be the 2-part test we're proposing. Now, we're not married to that. We know that Avangrid for UI had proposed a different percentage. So we are excited to talk about that 2-part test here today with all the key stakeholders. Another item is, should PURA desire to maintain the current RAM cycle, where we would have rate changes in the phase 1 for May 1st, and then a phase 2 change on September 1st, we would propose to incorporate the most up-to-date information should there be no changes at all, where the company would be allowed to include the preliminary best information available on the Millstone Seabrook, PPA information using the CL&P forecasts. And this way we can ensure that the May 1st rates, when they are implemented, if there's any deviation, again, from that base case costs and any forecasts that are included in there, we would be allowed on a monthly basis to, again, highlight for PURA and immediately put in front of them a proposal to change the rate. Now, just taking a step back, Eversource with Yankee Gas has a PGA rate mechanism that we have in place. That PGA rate we adjust on a monthly basis using a newly run forecast on purchased gas costs. And those forecasts, again, are run and updated monthly. We believe that having a similar process with Millstone and Seabrook PPAs is critical because it's essentially based on the same market. And being that it has shown to be so volatile in the past 5 years, including, unfortunately, 2 very unique circumstances, the pandemic and the geopolitical environment that we all suffered with the war in Ukraine, setting that aside, we still continue to believe that it's volatile enough to really make sure we monitor and have an opportunity to change those rates accordingly, even in the May 1, September 1 rate setting if we change nothing in the RAM. For the non-MBFMCC on that last bullet, anything that's not related to MBFMCC in our RAM rate setting process, proposed to limit the interim rate adjustments to September 1st. That would be our proposal again, if we are focusing this process to really highlight the ones we think will be most problematic. If we choose collectively not to change all the other RAM rate components, then we would propose that we do a true up for September 1st at the very least on any actuals. If there's a significant change again, whether we apply the two-part test or just do it based on actuals, that's again something we can discuss today. On prompt 2, next slide, please. Thank you. On prompt 2, CL&P's proposal on forecast methods for each expense item within the MBFMCC. In the past, Eversource did have a process in place, again, pre-2020, where all the subject matter experts and the experts across the functional areas at CL&P would provide the revenue requirements team with their expected forecasts on those costs. That's how we had built those rates on January 1 and July 1 across all the RAM rate components. In cases where the subject matter experts within the functional areas had no better information, they would have essentially done what we have in existence today, is they would have provided the costs that were incurred in the prior if they didn't expect the costs to come in significantly different than history. So in some cases, we actually did have costs in the RAM rate setting process for the rate components where some costs were based on historical actuals, but in other cases, the SMEs were responsible to ensure that all the line and the cost components, they evaluated, looked at their forecast when they worked with their budgeting analysts and the long range plan team. If they had any decision making to change those costs in the current year rate setting, they would communicate that to us and we would put that in the rate setting process. What we're proposing is we would go back to a process such as that, where we would be able to rely on the subject matter experts within the company and identify cases where the forecast would be used in the rate setting. That is something we have in place today within the RAM rate setting process and the known and measurables, where the company does talk to the subject matter experts on specific line items. But in cases where we have a known and measurable, we are only focused on the material ones, as opposed to taking a fresh look approach on every single line item. So hopefully I made that clear in the distinction of what the known and measurable is, where there are material changes that can be identified, as opposed to every single subject matter expert that's involved in the RAM rate setting process knows that they are responsible to identify the forecast. So you could have changes that would not be material that we don't pick up today in the known and measurable that would be picked up in the RAM rate setting process should we go to a moving forward process that's similar to what we had historically. I think I covered everything on this slide. At the end, I just wanted to highlight, I think we've said this several times in this proceeding and in the RAM rate proceeding as well, is that forecasts by their very nature are not going to be indicative of actuals. So we know that. We know setting future cost recovery for rate setting today based on a forecast for those costs is not going to be actuals. We all know that in this room. Forecasts in and of themselves are estimates, but we continue to believe that having the best information available at the time of the rate setting process is better than using a prior year actual as a proxy for current year costs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is prompt 3 here. We believe that aligning the Millstone and Seabrook in a separate MBFMCC rate, I'm going to start calling that rate 2.0 throughout this presentation. We believe that there is value in aligning Millstone and Seabrook as MBFMCC rate 2.0. We also believe that aligning that rate reconciliation and rate setting process with the standard service rate makes sense. So the costs are the major factors to the current MBFMCC rate and has been since the day Millstone came on board. And we have a graph in the prompt 3 handouts that I would like to share with you now, if I could, before we get into prompt 4. And if we could just turn to the next slide, please, so I can set up the scenario 1 and the scenario 2. So in our prompt 3, we were asked to split out the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs from the MBFMCC rate and present it to the stakeholders today to identify how that would look if we took the Millstone and Seabrook costs and align them with the standard service rate. So in scenario one, what we did is we created an MBF MCC rate 1.0, and that rate continues to recover and reconcile all costs within the MBF MCC rate today, all cost components, with the exception of Millstone and Seabrook as the prompt requested. So for illustrative purposes, what we did is in the MBF MCC rate going back starting 2020, January 1, 2020 through 2024, is we kept the MBF MCC rate 1.0 under the current historical actual results. So we did not change a thing. We went back in time starting 1/1/2020 and we said, what would happen starting 1/1/2020 if we pulled out Millstone and Seabrook costs and then ran with that? So in cases where when you pull out Millstone and Seabrook costs and you run with that analysis, you will see that we didn't have to change the process because there wasn't a significant material change to the MBF MCC rate. So in essence, what happened was the MBF MCC rate 1.0 was changed every May 1st. What we did keep were changes in the MBF MCC rate in history where we had a change on September 1, such as 2023 and 2024, because of circumstances outside of Millstone and Seabrook. So we felt it was appropriate to continue to honor that as real changes that would have happened in history, even taking out Millstone and Seabrook. For example, the EV costs were reflected in the September 1 rate. We kept that. So that's MBF MCC rate 1.0, and we'll move to the graph in 1 minute. MBF MCC 2.0 in scenario 1 is what we did is we created that MBF MCC rate 2.0, and that rate reflects the underlying costs for just Millstone and Seabrook and the consequences of those costs. And let me explain what I mean by that. Because this rate now, we went back in history and we changed time, we stripped it out of total MBF MCC and created a separate rate running January 1 and July 1 every year. In doing so, January 1 and July 1, we kept what actually occurred because if you recall, January and July 1 was actually using forecasts. So we had built costs into those rates under the scenario as it stood. We did not change history. So those align pretty exactly as what actually happened because we didn't change anything there. Where it does come into play is January 1, 2021, where now the process deviated from history, where it started to change. So beginning January 1 of 2021, what we did is we created a rate using Millstone and Seabrook costs based on prior historical as a proxy. And then every 6 months after that, we updated for actuals, but continued to use prior year as a proxy for current costs where it was beyond the point where actuals were available. So for example, in setting the July 1 rate, we used January, February, and March actuals, April, May, and June prior year as the proxy for the forecast in setting that rate. And then the same, of course, for July through December and setting that July 1 rate because we don't have the forecast in this scenario. We're using prior year as the proxy. So in doing so, and we'll show you in the modeling it out on the slides with the graphs, sort of the trajectory of that 2.0 in scenario 1, where the MBF MCC rate 2.0 relies on prior year costs as a proxy for current year. Scenario 2, what we decided to do here is we kept MBF MCC rate 1.0 because it wouldn't change. Stripping out Millstone and Seabrook did not change history. But what does change in scenario 2 is MBF MCC rate 2.0 continues to change January 1 and July 1. But what we've done here is we've used the process of using a forecast for the information available at that point in time, as opposed to the prior year to establish as our proxy for current year costs. So what does that mean? In MBF MCC rate 2.0 scenario 2, when we file for rate setting on July 1, 2021, for example, we asked Energy Supply to provide us the information as it existed at the time because they save it down. So we used forecasts that would have been available at that time. We didn't use hindsight here. We actually used history. So we received from the Energy Supply team the forecasts for the rate setting on July 1st. We used actuals January, February, March, and then we used forecast April, May, June, and then July through December. And we did that every 6 months. So for your January 1, 2021 rate, we used October, November, December forecasts, and then January through June forecast in setting that January 1 rate for that current 6-month period. And then in that January 1, we used July, August, and September actuals. So we continue to update that rate scenario 2, MBFMCC rate 2.0, under this concept where we would be able to use actuals and forecasts combined. So if we could now move to the prompt 3 handouts that we delivered this morning. The first slide on page 2 is essentially just explaining what I stated. The MBFMCC rate 1.0 excludes Millstone. Now recall, Millstone started October 1, 2019, and then Seabrook started January 1 of 2022. So we have stripped all those costs and implications of those costs out of 2023-24. MBFMCC rate 1.0, we made changes on January 1, 2020, July 1, 2020, and then after that, May 1 of 21, 22, 23, and 24. But in addition, we kept history as it was for September 1, 23 and September 1, 24, continuing to honor what actually transpired in history in the RAM rate proceeding. And as I stated, these costs changed for NBFMCC rate 2.0 in scenario 1 for Millstone and Seabrook on January 1 and July 1, keeping the current process that's in place today in the RAM rate proceeding of using historicals as your proxy. And then scenario 2, again, MBFMCC rate 1.0, nothing changed, stays the same, but your scenario 2 has your rate 2.0 with Millstone Seabrook using a forecast instead of prior year costs. So if you move to the next slide, please, slide 3. Thank you, I'm sorry, the prior slide. I didn't realize you were up ahead. Sorry about that. That one, yes, correct. Thank you. So this slide presents the first section of the slide gives you the monthly bill. So what we've done is, given that most of the focus is on the residential rate 1 customers, what is happening to our residential customers in the state of Connecticut with the RAM rate process. The first set of data provides you the monthly bill of actually what happened in history. So this is everything that happened in history, your actual bill for the residential rate 1 customer using 700 kilowatt hours a month. Now, keep in mind, there's going to be higher, lower based on usage, but this is using the average 700 kilowatt hours per month. On the bottom there, you'll see the actual bill at each point in time of the presentation, July 1 and January 1, of what the bill looked like. The second part of this slide shows a scenario 1 of what would have happened to public benefits, which is the yellow highlighted line item. What would have happened to public benefits if we broke out Millstone and Seabrook costs, included them in an MBFMCC 2.0 rate component, and had that MBFMCC rate change January 1 and July 1 to align with standard service rates as opposed to the RAM cycle. So your scenario 1 total on the bottom in that middle graph shows you the total bill impacts of making that change where you're using prior year as a proxy for Millstone and Seabrook, the current RAM process. The third part of the slide at the bottom there, the third graph in the slide, shows you the data points of what would occur in scenario 2, where we took MBFMCC 2.0 that includes Millstone Seabrook and used the forecast as a proxy. And so your scenario 2 total bill impact to customers of what their bill would have looked like across those periods in the last 5 years, and what their total bill would have been. Next slide, please. So here we show what the MBFMCC blue bar is today. And this is looking back 5 years. This is what the MBFMCC rate did. The orange is MBFMCC 1.0 when you essentially take out Millstone and Seabrook. So had there never been Millstone and Seabrook in terms of PPAs flowing through the MBFMCC, that's exactly what our history would have looked like. And you'll notice it's essentially flat. There's some price increases that happen to the total bill impact related to things like NCQF, items related to other PPA contracts, but certainly not related at all to the Millstone Seabrook. So when you have a scenario that you take out your Millstone Seabrook costs, had they never existed, your MBFMCC rate would have essentially been relatively stable throughout the last 5 years. Next slide, please. This one is just a simple scenario one that shows your residential rate one monthly bill, 700 kilowatt hours with your energy supply. So this is in comparison to the standard service rate for residential customers over the last 5 years. And looking at the Millstone Seabrook costs in MBF MCC rate 2.0, that would now change aligned with standard service rate on January 1, July 1, using prior year actuals as your proxy. So somewhat of a hedge. You'll see that it's a bit of a flat with some deviation there on January 1, 2023, when we saw the prices sort of spiking there. And you'll see that inverse relationship to standard service. And this was a prompt request in the tech meeting. And the next slide, and the last slide that I'll cover quickly, is our scenario 2. This does the same thing as the last slide in the graph there, except this takes the energy supply, which didn't change from the previous slide, and it includes a scenario 2 of MBF MCC rate 2.0 of your Millstone Seabrook PPA costs, assuming a forecast. Now you'll see here with the forecast, it almost mirrors, it looks like a direct mirror inverse image of your standard service rate. So here you can see we're using a forecast. It's not a 1-for-1, and that's not what we're claiming here, but you can clearly see that there is a relationship between your standard service rate and what was used to set the rates in standard service through the GSC rate. And also what we have done is included the forecast and actual run on a 6-month basis. What this does not show is the 2-step method of if it goes out of line, what would we do and what would we propose? We did not include that here, but again, that is certainly an area that we would love to speak to today. That is the end of my prepared remarks. We have prompt 4, which talks about rates. We've brought our rates expert here today. If there are any questions to speak to, I didn't bother reviewing that through the presentation because it was everything that was already on the record. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate this day.
Ms. Pruda, thank you very much. If the company has not done so already, could you please enter the handouts as correspondence into the record?
We sure can. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. With that then, UI, I think you're up for a presentation. Mr. Bumpin, can you get the slides up?
Thank you. Good morning. Heather Tabbets, Director of Regulatory for UI. So a lot of what Eversource already provided for information, I'm not going to go over because we are in a lot of agreement with them. But there are a few things that I will talk about. If you want to go to the first slide, please. Actually, I apologize. The next slide. Thank you. So as in our written comments, the company is proposing a twice per year reconciliation for the MBF MCC because we know that there can be volatility in the market. And capturing that volatility will allow the rates to more closely reflect the market sooner than later so that customers are paying now or receiving the benefits now instead of 6 to 12 months or even longer after that. Having an automatic rate change in October, which is what we've proposed in our written comments, allows the process to be streamlined. It also allows us for planning for our rate changes, which is very important to our customer service team when we have to discuss with our customers rate changes, and also IT and other parts of the business when we are trying to figure out our scheduling of rate changes. So as in our proposal, we believe that a filing could be made at the end of August and have rates effective on October 1st. The October 1st date was chosen by UI because it provides the opportunity to include actual data through July, which July has historically been a peak month, rather than a rate change for September, which could only include the actual data through June, which historically has not been a peak month. If PURA doesn't approve the proposal by UI to have 2 rate changes in a year, then we believe that the true-up mechanism that Eversource has proposed is the appropriate way to move forward. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of what Marissa spoke already about, I won't go over, which is already in our slide and in our written comments. So you can go to the next slide, please. So as noted here and also in our written comments, UI is going to use the same forecast methodology regardless of the presumptive period by which we're looking at. As Eversource also pointed out, our SMEs are going to be the ones who make the determination about what exactly will be going into any forecast methodologies. We do believe that incorporating January through March pricing, it will help avoid that uncertainty in the winter pricing. And we also believe that using the actual data for January through March will avoid that uncertainty and that we are seeing in the winter months. And it will also help reduce the December 31 unreconciled balance because actual costs instead of the forecasted costs will then be recovered for that portion of the rate. And we do believe that any interim rate change should incorporate updated forecasted PPA costs to better align with the best available data with the rates that we're going to be charging. That's really all I have for forecasting methodology. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go over what Eversource did, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kolka.
Next slide, please. Morning, Mark Holka, UI. We did similar analysis to the Eversource NBC FM and NBFMCC 1.0. So we went and we recalculated the rates without Millstone and the Seabrook contracts, and we initially brought Millstone into the NBFMCC rate on January 1st, 2020. So I went back to January 1st, 2020, and I recalculated the rates according to the dates that they were actually filed and when they became effective. So that was January 1st, 2020, then July 1st, 2021, and so forth, as you see on there. These no nuke rates, they're the ones that have everything else except for Millstone and Seabrook. I calculated those only once a year. And we did have separate rates that were primarily driven by the Millstone and Seabrook contracts. Those, we had interim rate changes and we had changes outside of that. We had a January 1st, 2023 rate change. And they were also, a lot of the September rate changes were required because of the nuclear contracts. So I made the calculations for the no nuke scenario based on just the regular timing, May 1st, because they yielded a pretty good annual amount without a lot of variation that happened because of the PPAs. And we do have a summary of what we produced that's in the appendix to this. We can look at the appendix after if you have any questions. So next slide, please. Okay. So the variability in the no nukes NBFMCC rate is greatly reduced because those PPAs were what has caused the volatility. And because of that, the unreconciled balances or the over and under collections, that's what I call, I call that unreconciled balance. Those drop also because you just don't have that volatility and that difference between actuals from one year to the next. That is really what was driven the volatility in the NBFMCC rate over the years. Then we have had NBFMCC rates that were set at 0 and that actually were driven into the credit range over the past few years because of the high market prices, and we got a lot more revenue for those. Net expense went way down for the nuclear contracts. So that's always an indication when you have to set a rate at 0 or a rate at a credit rate that there's an overcollection. And by stripping the nuclear contracts out, that the no nukes scenarios did not have these overcollections. So we were able to avoid 0 and credit rate NBFMCC rates for the no nukes portion. And then we didn't have to have any emergency rate changes either. We had one on January 1st, 2023, where we dropped that down well into a credit range just because the overcollected balance was so high due to the Millstone and Seabrook contracts. So next slide, please. So these are some of the more technical things that we found when we did this, and you can see the numbers behind this in the summary of the appendix, but much more variable, like I just mentioned. When we and I did not go back and do a 2.0 analysis that Eversource did. We could if necessary, but I didn't do that. I just took the rates that were actually in effect and took the difference between the actual NBFMCC rates and the no nukes rate, and that difference became the nukes only scenario. And then when you add the nukes only scenario to the standard service rates that are in effect at the time, you see that the standard service rate variability goes down too. And we show that in the slide in the appendix. So, but it is not a one-to-one correspondence, and that's been mentioned already. Because of the timing issues, the standard service was procured in tiers over a few quarters or maybe over a couple of years. So the standard service is not procured in real time, whereas the revenues that we get from these nuclear contracts, they are derived from the real-time energy markets at the ISO New England. So there is a timing difference, so you're not going to get that one-to-one correspondence, but they do move in opposite directions. And so then adding those two together does show on the bill that, yes, the variability does go down for the combined standard service and nukes only NBFMCC scenarios. Next slide, please. So that was that. And part of the written comments also asked for what do we do with allocators? And that's why this was discussed, our response to RRU 5, which is in the record. And the allocators that were asked to look at were the ones that we had proposed in our written comments back in 2024 and repeated in 2025 with these three allocators: the single CP allocator for the contracts for differences, the 12 CP allocator for the New England grid operator costs, and the energy allocators for the rest. So in general, the 1 CP favors customers that don't have as peaky a summer load annually. The 12 CP, that favors customers that, they may have a peaky summer load, but they avoid paying all of their, all of the charges based on that summer peaking load. But it is a demand allocator, so it does still favor higher load factor customers. And energy allocators always favor lower load factor customers. And that's a result really with any type of allocation methodology that we use. And the TOU rates, that does have the ability to provide more precise pricing signals, because TOU rates can incorporate higher rates for high load periods and lower rates for low load periods. And that's, next slide, please. I believe that's it for our rate design. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Kolka. Thank you to both companies for the presentations. And with that as our foregrounding for the discussion, we're going to move into the roundtable portion. And to get us started here, we're going to begin with the discussion topic in the meeting agenda regarding, sorry, let me find my notes here. The potential annual RAM adjustment rate change schedule, which was discussed by both presentations. And for that, I will hand it over to Mr. Norton to start us off with some questions.
Good morning, Jonathan Norton with Authority staff. Appreciate both presentations. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to start with some questioning toward UI for this first prompt on potential annual RAM adjustments and the rate change schedule. Firstly, the company proposed to alter the September 1st rate adjustment to an October 1st rate adjustment. Is that proposal for all mechanisms, or is the company proposing that just for the NBFMCC or the associated PPA volatility?
So we're open to suggestions on that, but we were thinking that the NBFMCC is the most volatile piece of the RAM itself. And so we would look to at least do the NBFMCC. To do the other components, we're not necessarily opposed to it, but we had not considered adding those.
And the actual October 1st date, I know that in your presentation, you had mentioned that that was selected in order to incorporate some more of the volatile nature of the month of July. But was there anything else that the company was considering by not selecting, say, November 1st, which would kind of represent an every 6-month rate adjustment, or how was the company thinking about that?
We really were just looking at incorporating another summer month. Again, we would not be opposed if that was a November 1st and incorporating August as well. But we just figured we at least needed to incorporate one of the summer months.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. What does UI mean about the automatic, when it says automatic rate adjustment for October 1st as described in slide 3 of the presentation? Could you just elaborate more on what you mean by automatic?
Sure. So today, our standard service offering is what I'll say an automatic rate adjustment, meaning we file the rates and we receive an order to implement them. And that's what we're looking here, to avoid a longer process, administrative process. If we were to have, in our example, October 1 rate change, we would look to have a filing by August 31st. That gives, we would look to have an order by September 22nd. That allows us a few days to get the rates implemented. That 3 weeks is probably not enough time to get through, we'll say, discovery and a hearing. And so given that this would not be what we would consider a full reconciliation of the rates, just an update, we would look to just get an order that just moves us forward without a hearing.
Yeah, similar to the way that the standard service and last resort service rates are approved on an interim basis, this would not eliminate the prudency review for the following year. These would all be trued up. We're just trying to get the revenue to where we think it needs to be to reduce the unreconciled balances.
So understanding your answer to one of my prior questions on being open to whether that's all mechanisms being trued up or just the NBFMCC, or even further, just the PPAs. I guess you can go one more step, just Millstone and Seabrook, right? Can you guys just expand on what the reporting structure would look like on August 31st that you alluded to on slide 3? You know, that would determine new rates at that time, kind of as compared to basically what we do, you know, for the May 1st rate adjustment right now? Could you-
Sure. Let's just assume we'll go with the NBFMCC that's updated. We would file Exhibit F, which is our NBFMCC schedules, along with our exhibits, I believe it's C, which is our summary of rates and showing what rates have changed and the effects of it.
And I would presume any other necessary analysis in regards to the PPAs to support whatever changes are being proposed?
Yes, we would include any additional analysis necessary to provide transparency to how we calculated the rates.
And you mentioned prudency review in your proposal. The prudency review essentially, in your eyes, would be the same happening, following that May 1st approval of the initial rate?
Yes, we would. That process would not change.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Does UI have in this scenario, it doesn't sound like this, but just to confirm and clarify, there wouldn't be another, I guess, in a scenario, if all mechanisms were trued up in your proposal, would there be a necessary stopping point to report those unreconciled balances, I think as Mr. Kolka calls them, over under collections, and like a relook at any known and measurable changes, or is that not what the company's proposing?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you asking if, what would we provide if we had an October 1 rate change, what months we would look at? I mean, I guess I envision we would include all of the months that would have already been included in our reconciliation filing in the spring. So if we were to file in August, we would look to, let me say a couple of things. One, let's assume that in our May 1 rate change, the January, February, and potentially March information was actual data, then we would look for the August filing to include April, May, June, and July actual data so that we would have a full 7 months of data in this October 1 rate change. Is that what you're asking? Maybe not.
Maybe partially. I guess what I'm just trying to clarify is UI isn't proposing to essentially go through a whole nother process of, and this goes back, I think, to what you mentioned, an automatic rate change. You're not proposing, or my question is, are you not proposing to just resubmit like a holistic all mechanisms picture with new deferral balances and like a known and measurable?
No.
Okay.
No, we were not looking to do that. We're just trying to make this simple as we can make it, but capturing the volatility as we've discussed throughout this morning.
Okay, thank you.
No, do you want to-
I th-
The one thing that we'll mention is RRU 10 provides a process, and I don't know if you have RRU 10 with you. I don't know, a process that we would look to.
Ms. Tebbets, the RU 10 reflects the process for filing for the October 1st adjustment. Is that what you were saying? Just to be clear.
And we've been providing the authority every few months with updated data. And that's kind of the process we were looking at, is again, just using that same process where we're updating information, but that would be included in not just a reporting it would actually be incorporated into a rate change.
Thank you. And I want to see if I can summarize the rate change schedule proposal from UI and have you please correct me where I am misunderstanding. But is it accurate to say that the proposal here in the slides and as presented today is to maintain the May 1st and September 1st dates, but additionally add for, let me be clear, May 1st and September 1st for all of the RAM components, but then add an additional automatic update as you've described it for October 1st to that also include July actuals for the nuclear PPAs. Is that accurate or have I mischaracterized the proposal?
I think that what we would actually be looking to do is not update the other components for September 1st. So avoid a September 1 rate change. We wouldn't want to have a May 1, a September 1, and October 1 rate change. We would like to just see either all components on October 1 or just the MBFMCC or just the PPAs, but only an October 1 rate change. No September 1 rate change for anything.
Okay, but maintain the May 1st setting of rates for the year for all RAM components. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, understood. And Mr. Colville,
Yeah.
please.
We're doing that, we wouldn't, if we eliminated the September 1st change, then any prudency reviews that came out of the second phase would then, the effect of those would have to show up on the May 1st rates the next year. Because sometimes, there's some changes that are made to the revenue requirements that would go into effect on September 1st. Those would either go into effect on October 1st if those components were changed, or they'd have to be captured, assuming that they'd be small, relatively speaking to the PPAs. They'd be captured in the reconciliation balances at the end of the year to go into effect on May 1st of the next year. So, the prudency reviews are still all going to be in there and caught up. It just may not happen on September 1st, according to this proposal.
Understood. And so then as you described it, then any prudence adjustments would be made the following May 1st. So they would effectively be around 2 years lagging, I guess, is because if we're looking at a prudency review for the prior year, but then not making the adjustments until May of the following year, do I have that timing?
Yes.
All right.
I mean, assuming that those are fairly small.
Sure.
The vast majority of these changes have happened because of the PPAs. So.
Okay. Thank you. Does anyone else have questions for UI's proposal?
Just-
OCC or Eversource? Go ahead.
So sorry to interrupt. Doug Horton with Eversource. On the last one, I thought I was tracking and then I wasn't on the 2-year lag thing. Wouldn't it just be the next year or no? Meaning if you're making a change in the fall, Mark, I think this is right. Would the review happen as part of that just next year's RAM 6 months
Yes.
later or so?
So if we go into the phase 2, where there may be some changes, and forget the PPAs because they wouldn't be included in this. There may be changes to some of the other components. We've seen some changes to IES. We've seen some changes to electric vehicles, those kind of things. That the prudency review, if it was to be changed, what would go into a September 1st rate change right now, these have been typically fairly small, not necessarily. And certainly if they were big, then we'd have to do something probably October 1st, something like that. We wouldn't want to have like the bonding that's happening right now. We wouldn't want to push that out. That would have to get into rates right now. But most of what we'd seen has been fairly small volatility. That would show up in the analysis that's done that we file on February 15th. We're going to have a final revenue requirement from the previous year that would come out of that phase 2 decision. And the revenues, the only thing that would change in this case would be the revenues would be different without that September 1st rate change than they would have been with that September 1st rate change.
Attorney Wheel?
Hi, Tom Wheel from OCC. Recognizing that Millstone and Seabrook are like not only the biggest PPAs in the NBFMCC, but the biggest pieces of the NBFMCC, we're just a little reluctant. So, I mean, I think we understand the no nukes framing to come from that perspective, but we're a little reluctant to the idea, if we're kind of talking about overall systemic changes to the RAM of tying this to like particular contracts or even particular generation sources, would it make more sense? It seems to make more sense from our perspective to make similar adjustments just tied to PPAs in general, or PPAs that are kind of directionally misaligned with the GSC, et cetera, as opposed to like just nuclear. Like there are other PPAs in the NBFMCC that work similarly but have a way smaller impact. Is there a reason? I guess the question is like, would the company object to a similar solution that's just sort of more broadly applicable to PPAs as opposed to just the nuclear PPAs?
No, I think that the idea behind including PPAs in general is what we're looking at. I think the analysis that Mr. Kolka put together was just to show the effects of the nuclear PPAs, but we would be open to including all PPAs, given the fact that you're right, we don't need to exclude any of the others.
And that is for UI's unbundled and BFMCC rates. That would be the state mandated energy purchases. So we could change that entire component.
And thanks. And Tom Wheel from OCC again. I just had one more question following up on PURA staff's questions. The September or October 1st filing, I heard the response to be filing like Exhibit F and the rate design exhibits. So is the idea to adjust the entire NBFMCC on that date in accordance with the over-under, the same way that the entire NBFMCC is adjusted now, or is it to only adjust the PPA cost components of the NBFMCC on that?
I mean, so I think that we're starting initially with looking at the PPA piece of it. And as I mentioned, we're open to the other pieces of it. We want to address the volatility, and that's the main piece of it. So again, we're open to ideas, but we do believe at minimum, we need to address the PPAs.
And that's the state mandated energy purchases category. We'd be looking to leave the other three categories unchanged.
Okay, thanks. And I'll just say, this isn't a question, but I'm sneaking it in anyway. The reason for the question is just our concern with, I think as we said in maybe our second set of written comments, we wouldn't have a concern with what UI is calling an automatic rate adjustment as to things like the PPA. Whereas for instance, our understanding for the way Millstone works is the company like literally has no input whatsoever. Like the process is essentially automated. So for that reason, we wouldn't have a concern with foregoing a hearing and the entire process as to those things, but we would absolutely be concerned with removing the hearing and evaluation process across the entire NBFMCC, because there are other areas in there that the company does have greater degrees of control over, if that makes sense.
Sure, and the PPAs are limited to the state mandated energy purchases unbundled component.
Ms. Peruta, I saw you reach for the mic. Did you want to add something?
Thank you, Marissa Peruta, Eversource Energy. I just wanted to add one thing to what UI said, which I don't disagree with. I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Heather. Our intent is to also try to minimize the number of times we change rates, right? So I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're saying is if we move a rate change in the RAM proceeding in its entirety, what your recommendation would be is you would move the current September 1 process to an October 1 or November 1, because I get it, you're trying to get that peak volume summer season into the rate setting, which Eversource is not disagreeing with. But something that was just mentioned with Attorney Wheel's discussion here is the components and a Millstone Seabrook change. Again, assuming nothing changes, Millstone is still in there, PPAs are still in there. What you're saying is it all changes once, right? You're recommending all components would change moving from November 1, or excuse me, from September 1 to October 1 or November 1. You're not recommending we have a change September 1 and then a later change for October 1, November 1 for the PPAs.
Correct. We do not want to have multiple rate changes. So if we're going to have an interim rate change, we would like it to be October 1, November 1. And, based on whatever comes out of this docket, meaning it's either all components, it's just the PPAs, whatever it is, we have one rate change. And the other thing we're requesting is that it be an automatic rate change, meaning, let me say that again. It's not PPA's automatic rate change, but if we're going to have a rate change, we don't want it to be a threshold potential rate change, because that provides a lot of uncertainty with our customer service folks, our billing folks, our IT, in determining whether or not we're going to have a rate change, because now we have to figure out, well, have we met those thresholds? When are we making our filing? How is this going to work? And the uncertainty makes it really difficult all around for the company. So we would like to have set rate changes, whether it be May, October, May, November, so that we can plan accordingly for those rate changes.
Thank you.
One more aspect of that I'd like to make sure we discuss is in the scenario that Ms. Pruda just described of a May 1, you establish the rates, whether it's the September change moves to October or November in the UI proposal, and the PPA component of the MBFMCC, the proposal is for that to be an automatic adjustment based on the filings that you described earlier, Exhibit F, C, and additional analysis on the changes. And in the current process, we also make, as Mr. Kolka was describing, some adjustments potentially for prudency or other factors that have come to light in the intervening months since May. I think in doing so, we hold a second set of hearings that are focused on the prudency review. And in your proposal, would the hearings still proceed on a similar schedule as they are now? Or would those be delayed to another point in time to coincide with Mr. Kolka's proposal for prudency adjustments happening in the following May?
So currently we have our prudency hearing in May, and we don't have another prudency hearing till the following May. And we would propose the same exact schedule. So again, the only thing that would change in our example is the PPAs, which is part of the MBFMCC, automatic rate change for a period in the fall, we'll say, a time frame in the fall, and then continue with this same schedule we've been on, which is the filings in the winter with a rate change in May, and then the prudency hearing at the end of May.
Thank you. That's crystal clear. Additional questions, Mr. Norton?
Yeah, I'm gonna just follow up with Eversource with some questions on prompt 1. So Eversource is proposing a 6-month true up, and that's specifically in your presentation only for the NBFMCC, or maybe more detailed, the PPAs, is that right? It wouldn't be all mechanisms that you're
We are
proposing?
currently focused on the MBFMCC rate, and more importantly, again, if nothing else, we believe the MBFMCC rates related to the Millstone Seabrook, and as Attorney Wheel indicated, potentially PPA, which again is a lot more work, but we're willing to do whatever we believe to be the right process. That should, if nothing else changes, we should really focus on the PPA rate change being January and July 1. Our proposal has been all along to not just look at the MBFMCC rate, but holistically to look at all rates. We have now come very close to the end of this proceeding and would like to very closely look at MBFMCC now, and even more importantly, Millstone and Seabrook and PPAs in general for January 1, July 1.
Got it. And how logistically would Eversource see, assuming that we either took the NBFMCC or just the PPAs or just Millstone and Seabrook, how does that look logistically on that 6-month true up process for January 1 and July 1 from a filing standpoint and timing in the docket?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we would do for NBFMCC, non-nuke as UI referred to it, our rate 2.0 is it would follow the same process as is currently in existence for the RAM rate component related to standard service rate LRS, so the GSC filings. So we would take that out and have a separate RAM rate component associated with PPAs or just Millstone, Seabrook, and the nukes, and have that follow that 6-month process. So logistically, we have a process in place today where we can adopt it, pull it out of the May 1, September 1 rate changes, and file it with the GSC. Now, the GSC rate is already part of the prudence review in the RAM rate proceeding. So when you think of the 8 RAM rate components that exist today, 6 essentially are the primary focuses in the RAM rate proceeding process of phase 1, but all 8 are part of the prudence review in the phase 2. So what we're saying is treat this like standard service in the RAM rate proceeding. You have 4 date changes for RAM rates when you look at the full rate setting process for all rate components, all 8. It's January, May, July, and potentially September post prudence review. So that would still stay intact. And that's essentially what Eversource has been proposing. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Horton.
Thank you. And I just wanted to try to bring it back a level, maybe just only for me. I think what we're proposing and have been trying to for a long time is that we want the rates to align with the costs across the board. As we're trying to respond to the prompts, both in the written comments and then in the prompts for the presentations today, we're also trying to read the room in terms of what PURA is asking or seeking to prioritize, because you could have rates change on May 1st and September 1st, and then we'd have recommendations associated with that if that's what PURA was trying to hold on to. Or we would be recommending other changes if PURA was open to having things change on January 1 and July 1. So we're trying to thread the needle and read minds a little bit. At the end of the day, our fundamental premise, though, is that we think these rates should be designed to align with the underlying costs, number one, which we think means reflecting rates to reflecting best available information in the rates when we set them. And then in particular for the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs, the presentation that Marissa walked through today, what we're trying to show is that really when you look at the rate volatility our customers have experienced the last 5 years, it's because of the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs. So if that's our objective, if we're focusing on the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs, then again, we think it makes sense to align those with January 1 and July 1 because it's supply related, although it's not a supply cost. It's supply related, so that makes some intuitive sense for customers. We've shown it serves as a potential for a natural hedge. But again, we're not really sure what PURA's priority is in all of this. And so I just wanted to try to clarify that our proposal is if you read our comments, we kind of said this. Our proposal is those 2 foundational principles, which is that rates should be designed to align with costs. And then if rates get out of alignment with costs, we should have a process to update them rather than waiting until a year later to update them, period.
And if I could just add to that, UI is in agreement. And again, we're just looking to have an opportunity twice a year to update our costs as well. And if the idea behind it is a January and July 1 to align with standard service, then we absolutely support that. And then obviously our suggestion of the October change would just not be, it would be a moot point, obviously. But we are in agreement that the best opportunity is to align these rates with our costs.
Which just,
Sorry.
Council Coleman, if I could just follow up on this one point, and then I'd love to recognize you to contribute here. So Mr. Horton and then Ms. Tebbets on the final comments you just made. So to align with the revenues with costs, the first proposal from the companies would be for July 1 and January 1 rate changes. If that's not the case, then these alternatives that we've been discussing for October or November adjustment is sort of the next, with a possibly different treatment for the NBFMCC PPAs, is sort of the next best option that the companies are putting forward. Is that accurate?
I can start. I think so. But the January 1 and July 1 rate alignment for me comes to the fact that, like I said, if you look the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs, and it could be all PPAs, but those PPAs are the ones that are supply related and then serve as that natural hedge. So, in our comments, we did say it makes sense to go back for all MBF-MCC and RAM rate components to a calendar year basis, because there is also some confusion that's created by having an off-cycle reconciliation period. So again, trying to figure out what PURA's preference is in it is difficult. But if the idea is, if nothing else, I would recommend that we align the PPA rate changes with the supply rate changes on January 1st and July 1st. If we kept the rest of the RAM rate components on a May cycle, I think those should all be changed based on projected information, best available information, for the reasons that we said. And then I would say for the same thing, if something within proved to be volatile or variable within these other rate changes, causing whatever process PURA uses to set the May 1st rates, if we now broke out the PPAs to a separate cycle, if something that was relied upon to set those rates change, like when LIDAR came to be, or something we knew was going to happen in the rate year, we should have rates be adjusted to reflect those costs as well. But our point is, as we look at the history, if we could only have had the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs changing based on the forecasted information and had them align with January 1st and July 1st, I think the rate experience would have been better for customers. But we also acknowledge in our comments that we know that the winter months in particular have proven to be very volatile. So if we're forecasting a January 1st or January 1st rate change, we're going to be capturing the most volatile months, and we've seen that turn on a dime. So that's why our proposal has been consistent, that PURA has to also have a way to monitor that. If we set the rate on January 1st, it's likely to be wrong, and we can't predict in which direction or what magnitude. So we think it makes sense to have a trigger for an automatic rate change, as we've been calling it, if that happens, to get rates back in alignment sooner than later.
We're in agreement with Eversource, yes.
All right, thank you both. Council Coleman?
Can you hear me? I guess I should have just sat next to Tom. Apologies. Consumer Council. I just had a follow-up going back to the discussion around the connection between the prudency review and the proposed, I guess, UI's proposal of adding an interim rate adjustment. If we were to add that interim rate adjustment in October as proposed, would it be feasible from the company's perspective to then do the prudency review with the initial May 1 adjustment to avoid having, a September 1 and October adjustment? And I guess I'll let you answer that, but I think that also extends more broadly if we're talking about the January and July scenario, thinking about the number of adjustments that customers will be experiencing. Would it be feasible from the EDC's perspective to, if we were to consider folding back in the prudency review in that initial May 1 adjustment?
Yeah, I think that the May 1 adjustment should include the prudency review, and that any adjustments during the year outside of that May 1 rate change would not include a prudency review. We would only have it once a year. I think, one, it's administratively efficient. Two, it allows all parties to look at the RAM as a whole instead of just in pieces, because we anticipate that the rate change, we'll say in the fall, if that proposal that we had put forward is approved, would only be a portion, a piece of a RAM component. So I don't think it would be appropriate to have a prudency review on a very small piece. Although the dollars are large, the review is just very restricted.
Thank you, Marissa Peruta at Eversource. I just want to make sure when we're talking about the prudence review, what we're looking at, I believe, again, Heather, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a very isolated situation where we're only looking at something that would have been pushed to a September 1, October 1 rate change, correct? That could be reviewed as part of the March phase 1, which typically is not prudence, but we would have almost like a unique set of circumstances where we would have to have this one particular cost component go through a prudence review, correct? Because to push everything out of phase 2 into phase 1 would be really difficult to do. And that's not what you're proposing, right, Heather? Not on all RAM rate components to be part of our March phase one hearing process and discovery. Because that would be really complicated with the current construct of the RAM filing requirements.
I think what we're proposing is we are really just proposing to not make any other changes to the process. The only process change we're looking at is an interim rate change for the PPAs, whenever that happens. And as part of the interim process, there would not be a prudency review for that interim rate change because we're already doing a prudency review, we'll say, in the spring.
As part of our May, correct?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So if I could try to play that back, just, I think what I'm hearing makes sense. I think what you're saying is if we keep with, don't do a January 1 and July 1st rate change for anything, we stick with a May 1st rate change, then the idea would be to have a May 1st rate change and really nothing changes in that May 1 rate change process, except potentially having rates be updated to reflect costs. We're in agreement on that. And then we continue through the phase 2. And I think UI's proposal is to change the second potential rate change from September 1st to October 1st and have that be an automatic rate change for anything that comes out of the phase 2 prudency review, or excuse me, it would be for a rate change for anything that comes out of the phase 2 prudency review, just like current process, just change the date, and then to have an automatic rate change to update latest information on the PPAs.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Thanks. I didn't do a great job explaining it. Thanks.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to our second prompt to discuss potential thresholds for adjustments outside of annual RAM adjustment rate change schedule. I'd like to start with Eversource on this one. With my first question, if Eversource's proposed January 1 and July 1 rate adjustment for the NBFMCC was adopted, what would be the expected timing of when rate year forecasts would be supplied and reviewed? And how would this structure ensure that over and under collections are being reconciled properly?
Okay, so if we did a January 1 and July 1st rate change just for the PPAs, is that what you're focused on?
I guess I realize that question is a little bit, based on what we've discussed, the proposal is keep the process and add, potentially carve out another rate, I think as Ms. Peruta mentioned for PPAs that would, I guess my question would be, would that be treated as, I guess kind of a, similar to how UI is putting it, like a more of an automatic on January and July 1 for those PPAs and as needed, like an automatic rate change?
Right, as soon as we'd have, and we can confer on when the date would be, but our proposal would be to have the January 1 and July 1st rates change based on the latest available information. So as close as we can reasonably produce the forecast, set the rate and have PURA approve it prior to January 1st and July 1st for the PPAs. That would be our proposal, and we can work on the dates of that. And it would be for a 6-month window. But we, again, want to make sure that our proposal, if you will, use that word, is that we're trying to also we want to make it clear that there also then needs to be some other out if that's wrong. Because like I said, we acknowledge, and in our comments are clear, that January 1st forecast is going to include a forecast for the most volatile months. And we've seen in the last 4 years, the forecast that we have in December can be very, very wrong. So if we're going to do that, there's value to doing that, but we need to have the second component and an ability to update the rate if it proves to be wrong.
Thank you. And specifically on this prompt with the thresholds, what would be the, I guess, definitive detailed determinant of whether the costs were at least either compared to proxy actuals or whatever's built into the rates, when that would actually be, crossing that 5% threshold? So what determinants are being looked at specifically in order to calculate a plus or minus 5% swing? in triggering some type of adjustment.
Yes, Marissa Pruda, Eversource. So on the two-part test, the first 5% test, taking, let's just say PPAs in the MBFMCC rate 2.0, you have the base case costs setting the rate for January 1. That rate goes into effect. The company would then, on a monthly basis for that particular rate, see the actuals coming through. If the over-under recovery and the actual cost compared to base case rate setting forecasts for that 6-month period became greater than a change of 5%. So let's assume the costs to build the rate were $50 million. If the over-under recovery, meaning actuals coming through compared to whatever we used as the forecast cost, came to 5% of the 50 million, then we would move to the second part of the test to ask ourselves, is that going to have a greater than 1% bill impact to customers? Likely focusing on residential rate 1 customers to see if whatever that change would be to total bill impact is greater than 1%. At that point, if it passed both parts, we would file a request to PURA to make a rate change, and we would request that increase or decrease, it could go either way, be reflected over the coming 12 months, because we know in a period of a 6-month rate, if you have a rate change in that very now much smaller period, you're going to create volatility if we propose a rate change in a truncated period of time within a 6-month period. So our proposal today for everyone to consider is, if that should happen, we would propose that rate factor, additional incremental rate factor, to be over a 12-month period going forward.
And that 1% as the second part of the test, that would be what a rate 1 or average customer would experience on the whole, not just specific to like the NBFMCC rate, correct? A 1%.
Right.
Got it. Does UI also see, understanding that I think in UI's presentation that UI had said that this 2-step process was also now being recommended by UI. Do you see it the same way as Eversource?
My understanding is that Eversource is not asking for 2 rate changes. They're asking for the initial rate change that we have every year and a threshold rate change. If that's not correct, please tell me. UI is asking to have 2 rate changes set, so there's no threshold to be made. In the event that the threshold is not met, we don't have a rate change. We would rather have 2 prescribed rate changes for the year that are set.
So, Ms. Tebbets, is it the case that UI does not support having a threshold requirement? Instead, you're looking for just 2 fixed rate changes?
We're looking for 2 fixed rate changes. In the event that the authority does not agree, then we would say we agree with the method that Eversource has come up with for an interim rate change.
Understood.
On the other side, yes.
Okay. A minor point of clarification, Ms. Pruda, on the determination of the 5%. That whether the 5% threshold is met would be based on the accumulated under or over collection, or the accumulated variance, I guess, of costs and revenues. Is that accurate?
When you're Yeah, thank you for the moment. Initially, I was thinking you meant the cumulative over under recovery, but you're referring to, would you at the point of evaluating the rate change on a monthly basis, not just look at your actuals, but do a recasting of the forecast to see where you will be? Is that what you're asking? Because the answer would be yes. On a monthly basis, we definitely would look at a reforecasting. I think it's important to go back to what Mr. Horton said earlier, which is, we know forecasts are not going to be indicative of actuals. So we really should be checking the pulse very regularly on the forecast to make sure we are not far from where we expect to be in the future.
That adds another dimension that I wasn't considering. I think my question was more based on your description of how, like the monthly view of how actuals are coming in versus how the rate was set. So essentially, the accumulation of variances on a monthly basis is what would produce what would need to meet the 5% threshold.
It is. It is a cumulative view. So you have to look at actuals, right? So let's say in the first month, you're looking at your actuals to forecast and you're at 4%. Then you go to the second month, it's not siloed to just the monthly activity. You are now looking at the full impact to determine if you've met the 5% or more threshold. And in addition to that, then comparing it to the total bill impact. So to answer your question, yes, that is correct. It would be cumulative.
So, but to be clear, cumulative, but based on actual and forecast and actual and reforecast. And that's why, again, and I'm just trying to, we're trying with our comments to be fulsome. I wouldn't call what we're proposing a proposal. We're trying to be responsive to what PURA has asked for prompts. We definitely propose that a rate should change, but our proposal just boils down to those two things that I'm a brokered record on, that rate should be set to reflect our actual costs. And then when rates become misaligned with our costs, we have a process that adjusts rates to reflect them. That's our proposal. With our comments, we're trying to work within the parameters. So right now, the parameter is that we can't use any forecasts. So if that's a priority for PURA, we would probably have different recommendations. Our proposal, though, is to rely on forecasts. And so if we rely on forecasts, then we think that we should continue to rely on forecasts and update them because that is the latest available information. So I just wanted to hammer that point a little bit more.
And just to add, this is not a known, right? If we look at the current Yankee Gas and CNG and SCG PGA rate, that is something that is reset monthly and is based on a reforecasting. And so the existence of this process is here in Connecticut. It's also in Massachusetts, as we indicated in our written comments, where we have the purchase gas adjustment clause there for purchase gas, where they actually, we somewhat mirrored it and of course are open to any other threshold, but our thresholds that we established in our written comments here are mirroring what they do in Massachusetts for their cost of gas, where if they exceed that 5% for actuals and reforecasting every month, then they would propose a new rate and it would go in essentially a perfunctory filing where it would go into rate setting immediately, where the Massachusetts PUC would approve it knowing that they have this pre-established process in place.
How much for both Eversource and UI, I guess we can start with Eversource, how much would that 5% increase or decrease in costs amount to in real costs, assuming we're talking about each company's, I guess, set costs in the rate? What would 5% actually represent?
I think the reason, starting with Eversource, the reason we had the two-part test is we can't really tell you what the 5% would be because the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs, some years are a large credit, some years are a large cost, and some years are zero. So the 5% can be meaningless or very material. The 1% bill impact is roughly 50 to 75 million for Eversource.
Yeah, same answer for us, right? We are unsure what the 5%, we would have to look at what the impact is for that year.
Does UI have an estimate on what a 1% bill impact would look like in dollars for customers?
1% on a total radar bill or total company wise?
Yeah, we can go with, I guess, radar for an average customer, what total cost would have to be additionally incurred or credits coming in to effectively reach that 1% bill impact for UI.
Hold on. just for radar, I think it's probably about $5 million. Maybe a little less.
Okay, thank you.
Another point of clarification on the two-part test. I understand it to be sequential, that you would first look for the 5% for the rate component and then 1% for total bill. Is that accurate?
That's right.
Is there ever a circumstance where a variance could meet the 1% but not the 5% of a rate component, or is that unlikely?
I could make up a scenario where that could happen, yeah.
Okay.
If the cost was a large credit or a large cost for the net cost or benefit of the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs, if that was embedded into the rate as a large amount, and then it varied, potentially it couldn't trigger that first, 5%. I'm trying to make up a scenario in my mind on the fly and I can't.
No
But I can
need
imagine
to.
it could happen. Our idea was just recognizing, so the comparable analysis in Massachusetts we keep pointing to is the cost of gas adjustment clause. That's always a cost. So this 5% it's the only applicable rule. However, here, like I said, it's sometimes it's a credit, sometimes it's zero, and sometimes it's a cost. And so the 5% as underlying the amount that we're collecting for the PPAs may be a big number, it may be a small number if it's zero, right? That if we're putting a net cost of zero into rates, 5% is not, well, 5% of zero is zero, but you know what I mean. So that's why we thought it was appropriate to have a two-part test. The reason to have a two-part test as well gets back to, for us, trying to administer this, if we can monitor the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs or all PPAs on a monthly basis, we need to have a way that's repeatable, quick, that we can measure, identify is there a problem, and then submit a filing in very short order. And trying to, we probably could come up with a model to do a bill impact test, but our idea was to focus on focus on the PPAs, monitor changes in the LMPs, and then have that indicate to us is something going awry that would cause us to have to make an adjustment. And that was a reason for having the two-part test as opposed to just proposing a bill impact test.
So it sounds like the rationale for the two-part test, starting with 5% for the individual component, is that it would be a quicker way to identify whether something is varying significantly, as opposed to looking at a total bill analysis on an ongoing basis, which is sort of the second threshold to be met.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Is a total bill test only a possible threshold analysis to do? And what would that look like to be feasible for the companies?
I'm not sure what the process is from here. I think I would just prefer, I would love to take that back and just try to noodle on what some scenarios could be, because like I said, the underlying thing we're trying to solve is all over the place. So if you build a large credit into rates, I don't know, I just want to be able to model out some scenarios and see what that could do. I'm sure it can be done though. Just having some rules of thumb backing into like, a typical bill impact is 50 to 75 million. So we could, I'm sure, build out some logic to have it just be a one-part test, but if we could take that back and supplement or something.
Okay. Do you have anything else?
Just, question for OCC on this. I know OCC opined in the written comments that if a threshold was adopted to determine a rate adjustment, that it should be based on bill impact. What does OCC think about the 1% threshold in this proposal?
Thanks for the question. It's the question I was hoping we wouldn't be asked, which is like what particular thresholds we would recommend, because I think that's the hardest question here. It's hard to say. I think it's my immediate answer is similar, I think, to Mr. Horton's answer with respect to the 5% threshold on variance of the PPA is that I think whether the 1% is material kind of ultimately depends on what the overall picture is. It's probably, I mean, it's easier to predict than the Millstone contract, which could be, a $1 differential. I think 1%, the thing that stands out to me immediately is the difference between the two companies because of their different sizes in terms of revenues. That 1% is like it's 50 to 75 million for Eversource and 5 million, I think, Mr.
Well, that was for radar. Radar, in the NBFMCC is about 30%. So, when you look at it that way and you divide the 4.5 to 5 million by 30%, you come up with pretty close to 15 million of the total. And that's pretty close to 20 we see that 80-20 through almost everything. So they do align.
I will answer a question you didn't ask, which is getting, I think, to what Mr. Kramer was asking about the two-part test. I just sort of an answer and sort of a statement. I think the two-part test makes sense. And without like an understanding of the practical realities of this, to me, it intuitively makes sense to have the sequence of the two-part test in the reverse of what Eversource is suggesting. Because to me, it just makes sense to measure, is something going awry here in terms of total bill impact? And then to measure, is the reason why this is going awry because of the PPAs? And so in my mind, it would make more sense to consider, is there a potential for overall rate shock? And then to look at, is the reason for that potential because of the misalignment between actual costs and revenues, like using the same process that Eversource is suggesting? Again, though, I don't know whether I accept the possibility that that's administratively too burdensome and that it's easier to kind of do it in the reverse. But I think from our perspective, that's what's important, is that we're trying to avoid, the concept of rate shock. We're trying to set up I think we're all in alignment that we're trying to set up a scenario where there's a stopgap, where there's some system in place to detect, is there a potential for this massively going in the wrong direction? And is there something we can do to stop that? And so getting back to the question you did ask, if a 1% variance is being offered as the kind of suggestion, as a touch point to suggest that things might be going wrong, I think that might make sense. I think my initial instinct is that 1% might be minimal in terms of, like, I don't know that we would define rate shock as a 1% increase in overall bills. But if the concept is that a 1% overall increase in bills is indicative that rate shock might be coming, then that does make sense.
Thank you, Attorney Wheel. Shifting topics just slightly within this same second discussion topic, Mr. Horton has made some comments about the forecast versus the existing process versus, which is using the prior year's actuals as a proxy. And Ms. Pruda, you in your presentation identified a distinction between the forecasting process that would rely on best available information from Eversource's SMEs and the known and measurable standard as described in the RAM proceedings as being, if I understood you correctly, a difference of materiality in terms of what rises to the level of known and measurable might be a higher level of materiality versus what is considered by the SMEs during the forecasting process. First question is, did I understand that distinction accurately in terms of how the company sees the proxy plus known and measurable versus a forecasting process in the RAM?
Almost. I just want to make sure that I don't put us up against the wall here, because that is somewhat correct in the case that when we moved to prior year costs as a current year proxy with a known and measurable, the process was essentially wiped away, right? So now we had to think about what is a known and measurable, because now we need to use prior year cost to start and then move into a known and measurable. So somewhat left in the hands of the revenue requirements team to work with the subject matter experts to say, is there anything material that we want to put in a known and measurable that we would be able to present to PURA and allow them to accept it as a valid, known and measurable cost to update the prior proxy. So some of that was met with hesitation. Clearly, having a known and measurable as opposed to, hey, subject matter experts, give me your forecast, right? Because that's the mandate in PURA's RAM process is very different and it's received very differently. If we moved to a process where the RAM is on a forecasted basis and the company would be allowed to work with the SMEs as we had in the past to state, take a look at your costs for the upcoming year. What have you provided to the company in terms of your long-range plan? What have you provided to the subject matter experts in the budgeting area of the organization? Please give us those costs and we will incorporate those into the RAM rate proceeding. Very different than going to them and talking about a known and measurable costs that would be subject to the review of PURA and approved. And I'll let Mr. Horton add anything in case I did miss anything.
Well, I just only that, and again, if we take a step back to 2020, when this changed, at that time, the process had been to have two rate changes on January 1st and July 1st based on forecasts. And we had a rate change, which was actually pretty small looking back in history. It was a $4.50 roughly change related to the Millstone and Seabrook PPAs. You know, customers reacted very negatively. PURA ultimately rolled back that rate, kicked off a process to change the RAM rate setting process, which brings us to today. So the process, the outcome of that was to have rates change on a different schedule and then no more forecasts. Forecasts were no longer, and instead we adopted this known and measurable standard, which has a particular meaning to utility companies. A known and measurable standard is different than a forecast. So we've had 4 years of evolution, and I know I've said multiple times in this hearing room and on others that if you want us to use forecast, we can use forecast because we've been challenged on why we didn't include a certain known and measurable or why we did. We have orders that to us are very inconsistent in the applicability of a known and measurable standard for something like on the ESI, which is never accepted by PURA, and then in the same order adopting a known and measurable change for something that we didn't even propose in the same order. So we don't know what PURA means for known and measurable, but our objective is to try to get to a place again where rates are reflecting underlying costs. So if PURA is open to relying on forecasts, we would fully embrace that and think that PURA should. The point is that some elements of what we would put into that forecast would be last year's actuals, because that's the best information we might have. Some elements might be relying on forecasts by a third party that we subscribe to for things like locational marginal prices. We don't forecast what the market's going to do. We subscribe to experts who do, and then we'd flow that in. Other cases, we might go to, the customer group or a particular area and say, hey, what do you expect to be your cost to be incurred for this particular RAM element in the proceeding? And at the end of the day, we know that whatever we put into the rate is going to be fully scrutinized and reconciled to what we actually incur and what's found to be prudent by PURA. But again, our position is those two things, that we think that the rate should be set to reflect the best available information and then adjusted when that information goes awry for whatever reason on all RAM components.
Thank you. As a quick follow-up, I think, Ms. Pruda, you also described going to the subject matter experts, and it's a different conversation of taking what's a known and measurable change to last year versus what's your forecast for this year. Is it the case that those subject matter experts start by looking at what happened in last year and what would be different for this year? Or is that not a practice for how they would forecast?
No, it is, because all departments at Eversource have to produce a budget. So every department where there are costs, clearly where we have costs and most departments have costs. So they do go through the process of determining what is going to be my cost in the coming year. And then they have to provide it to the budgeting team, et cetera, in order to establish next year's budget and also within the long range plan ultimately. So that does exist. What I want to sort of take a step back on is when you have a process where you are including, sorry, I keep getting feedback, where you have a process where you are including your forecasted costs within a RAM rate setting process, administratively, that is simple. Administratively, please, nothing is simple in the RAM rate setting process, but when you have a forecast, as we did in the past, we take those costs, put them in, file it, knowing that this is the forecast from our subject matter experts for which they provide already in their own functional area process. When you move to a known and measurable, it's a very different administrative process in the RAM rate proceeding, because now you are presenting it separate and distinct from everything else. Do you see what I'm saying? So it sort of took a different approach, and known and measurable in itself, the actual definition of known and measurable in our company has a much higher standard than when you are looking at a forecast, if you will. Is it material? Is it absolutely certain it will occur? How much of the information that you have available today and the facts and circumstances you have available today, you have with certainty. So the forecast is a process where they have to establish costs in order to put into the budgeted year. That is still under a known and measurable, but their materiality for it is pennies and dollars. Do you see that difference? So what I'm saying is in a place where we had a forecasted process put into the RAM rate setting, you would have more forecasts, including in your RAM rate setting, because we just took the forecast. In a process where we are looking at known and measurables, we go after the SMEs to say, tell me what you have that is known and measurable. They're not going to give us $25,000. They're not going to give us the $50,000 amounts, right? They're going to give us the amounts that are significant and changing, where they know they're hiring individuals, where they have specific unique costs that are now incremental than prior year's costs. And so there's a whole different method to what the SME is doing. I can't speak to every SME. What I can speak to is the SMEs that do provide us with the known and measurables and the process that they go through in order to provide us that information to include in our January 15th filing.
Thank you. And I think what I'm hearing that is possibly two dimensions. The first is a definitional issue around the company's standard for what meets a known and measurable threshold. And the second is I think you used the word, the administrative process or the scrutiny that's applied to known and measurable versus a forecast. So I want to ask a question on both of those pieces. And obviously UI can jump in on any of this discussion of forecasts if you're interested in weighing in. But in terms of the definition, is the company's definition for known and measurable different from the known and measurable guidance that's been issued in the RAM proceeding over the past 4 years?
I mean, I think that's the point that I'm making. I couldn't articulate the standard that PURA is applying to known and measurable. And I'm not trying to be, and it probably seems that I am, I'm not trying to pick a fight, but I can't understand it because it's applied differently depending on different elements within the RAM.
Okay.
That's the bottom line.
So there's a difference there between the guidance given in the RAM and what the company's definition of known and measurable is.
Well, there's difference between, my point is there's difference between how PURA applies the known and measurable standard within the RAM.
I see.
To different elements of the RAM. There's a different way. Like I said, ESI, I can tell you what the ESI is going to be within a couple $100,000, and we have tried to propose what those changes would be, and it has been repeatedly denied in the RAM.
I hear your point. Thank you. And the second piece was on the substantiation and the administrative process of looking at known and measurable adjustments versus looking at the forecast. And I guess one question I would have about that is there a way to present a forecast to be used in the RAM proceeding that gives a level of visibility into the assumptions, inputs, changes, the level of articulation and understanding of what's behind the forecast that in known and measurable, it gives you an opportunity to explain what those changes are and to quantify them. Is there a similar opportunity that the company sees to be able to substantiate a forecast and explain the underlying assumptions, inputs, and data in a way that gives the same level of visibility and visibility to how the forecast is generated?
Yes, I think if we're saying, and again, if we were to go to a model where we still have a May 1st rate change for all the RAM components, rather than including a known and measurable filing, have a forecast filing where we present what we want the rates to be for May 1st, then we would have similar testimony. I don't know, we'd have to work on what the timing could be. But we'd have, testimony that describes how did we arrive at the dollars and rates that we're proposing. Certainly that could be done. I think, that takes, it's a different standard that we would apply in order to arrive at that rate if we were accepting, or PURA was accepting a forecast to go into the end result. Because like I said, at the end of the day, it's going to be reconciled to actual. So that would need to, but certainly we could come to a process where we're relying on forecasted information and describing for each component, how did we get that forecast? And like Marissa said, in some cases, we might be recommending to rely on the prior year's actuals in setting the current year's rates, whereas in others, I don't know that we'd even look at the prior year actuals if we're making a forecast. We would only be, I would think the L&Ps, we wouldn't give much attention to what happened last year, because our experience is that for the PPAs, it really is more important to understand what is going to happen this year based on the actual L&Ps, the operation of the facilities, et cetera.
Does UI or OCC want to be heard on the topic of forecasts?
So prior to the new process, we would put in a forecast. We would go to extract those forecasts from the budgeting tool. And the folks who are responsible for their area budgets put in the values, and we would extract what the budgets were, and they were shown out by month. So that's what we used for our forecast, which was what next year's budget was going to be. And in each area, there would be a number of line items, because they would have to forecast by some kind of line item breakdown. We would take that and add it all up, because we didn't necessarily care about each individual line item. You may have a dozen line items, you may have 100 line items that built up to that component's forecast. With the forecast approach, people would put in their best estimate, and management will hold people to explain variances on their budget throughout the year. So it wasn't just something people put together, it was something that people put together that they had to substantiate to the higher management. Now, going through each line item, though, applying a known and measurable standard, in the old days, if the classic example, I think, with that would be like a union contract, where a union contract is coming in and the price is going to go up, or that you've signed a contract with some group and you're going to start paying this, or a contract drops off. So that's something that rises to a high level of being known and being measurable. And that might be just a subset of the line items in a budget. And so you could go through and pick off each line item and say, well, I know this to a very high degree of certainty. This, we're kind of guessing on, and this we use last year's value because we don't have any better. To do a known and measurable, I have to go through and look at all these line items that they're forecasting, say, do I really know that to the level that we can say is going to be known and measurable? And then when we file it, that level may not satisfy the authority's definition of what they're looking at right there. There's no bright line definition of what known and measurable is. I don't know if there can be a bright line definition of it, but when it comes to, we'll know it when we see it, that's a difficult way to go about deciding what we want to put in, what we think we should put in, into a known and measurable. Whereas with a forecast, we could go, this is our forecast, and then the reliance is to substantiate that, and maybe the authority would then look at it and say, well, that works, that doesn't, so we'll accept these, and then we get to that forecast there. But at least we have a better idea of what we need to include. We include everything, and then we can go line item by line item to see if that really meets the authority's expectation for setting rates.
Thank you, Mr. Kolka. OCC.
Tom Wheel from OCC. I think I think I agree with the last part of, well, I don't disagree with anything anyone said really, with except, particular comments about historical facts. But I very much agree with what Mr. Kolka was just saying. I was going to say something similar. I think we talked about this a lot in our comments. To us, the semantics don't matter as much as the goal, and the goal, I think everyone agrees, should just be accuracy. I think the goal is to make rates reflect costs as closely as possible, but with the acknowledgement that accuracy is impossible. Like there is no, like we all want accuracy, but we have to walk into this knowing there is no such thing as accuracy. And I think the way to get there is to get as much information on the table as possible and then see what makes sense in a given year, given the circumstances that surround like any decision as to any of these elements. There can be reasons like OCC took positions this year with respect to forecasts for PPAs where we were recommending like a conservative adjustment to maybe what forecasts look like because we're kind of nervous about like what if this is wrong? What if we end up in a massive under recovery again? And I think that's the future we would like to see. I think is that is for for there to maybe be less focus on the semantics of sort of what is allowed or not allowed to be filed, but just to have a conversation using all available information and be able to advocate for the outcomes based on what information is sort of on the table. So I don't know if that's exactly what the utilities are saying, but I think we agree generally with the concepts that forecast the information that the utilities get from their third-party experts that have forecasted data. That information is valuable and useful and should be considered. I don't think we'd go as far as to say that information should just be the proxy for rate making, but should definitely be part of the mix.
Thank you. Commissioners, I'm going to recommend that we take a 10-minute break. And then I think we can come back for our final two discussion topics.
Great.
That would put us back at 12:05.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're all back. So Mr. Kramer, topic 3.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Gillette. So the third discussion topic for today is the potential alignment between the nuclear PPAs and standard service rate changes. And we've been, I think, peripherally addressing this topic somewhat throughout the first two discussions we've had this morning, but a few additional clarifications and questions to develop here. So to get us started on that, I'm gonna hand the microphone over to Mr. Norton.
Thank you. To start, I got a question for both companies. I guess we can start with UI. Can the company foresee any potential unintended consequences of a type of automatic true up of the net PPAs? In the case of Eversource, obviously July 1st and January 1st, and but for UI, is there any expected unintended consequences of implementing something like this?
I can't say there won't be unintended consequences just because I can't think of anything off the top of my head in the moment, but it's a great question, I guess, right? There's always unintended consequences of everything. We do not foresee any unintended consequences of utilizing the opportunity to have an interim rate adjustment.
Eversource?
And I would just say the one that I see if we went to the January 1st and July 1st is the one I mentioned before. Not an unintended consequence, but a reality, a known reality, is that we would be relying on a forecast in December that has proven to be volatile and in the end variable to what actually happens. So that's why, I had the two-pronged approach. So, but that's going to happen whether we go to January 1st and July 1st, or we stick with the May 1st and then have another adjustment at various points in time. So it again gets back to, in my mind, the volatility that we've seen in the RAM has largely been driven by the PPAs. And no matter what process PURA ultimately adopts, you're going to have the potential for there to be an unintended consequence that the rate is set to be or actually misaligned with the costs. And that's where it's important to have some way to get them back in alignment sooner, in my mind.
Got it. And I don't know if you were alluding to this in your answer, but on our topic here related to aligning the effects of the PPAs with standard service, would it be more appropriate to, in looking at what has actualized as a result of the LMPs, say in January, February, and March, those winter months, is it more appropriate to have the actualized portion of the effects of those PPAs, either net benefit or net cost, be incorporated into, say, May 1st, and then for the forecast for the remainder of the year to align with when standard service rates are changed, or vice versa? Is there a better structure to incorporate that forecast at a better time that would align and put in parallel those procurements with standard service to where we're working more closely with apples to apples? Does that make sense?
So I think is what you're asking, that you'd have a May 1st rate change for the PPAs inclusive of actual and net cost or benefit for January, February, and March, and then have a forecast or that MBFMCC rate change, say on July 1st, based on a forecast to align.
I guess what I'm wondering if there's a scenario that would align the procurements happening in standard service with the effects of the PPAs more accurately, so that we're moving further away from a scenario where standard service and the effects of the LMPs effectively are going in the same direction. So is there a scenario between the two that you feel would align better with ensuring that, we don't have like a double increase or a double decrease scenario?
I mean, I think that's why we're recommending PURA consider aligning the PPA rate change with standard service on January 1st and July 1st. Because if the procurement of standard service was done at the same time that we set the MBFMCC rate for the PPAs, excuse me, then I would expect those two things to be a hedge. Meaning, if you're gonna set the standard service rate entirely on a forecast and you snap the chalk line at that same day and said, here's what the PPA rate should be, then you'd have a perfectly hedged, based on my understanding of the world, you'd have a perfectly hedged two rates go into effect at the same time. That's not how standard service is procured today. But with SB4, it's moving somewhat in that direction. And we showed, and that was the intent of the chart that Marissa showed, that even with the prior standard service procurements, which is laddered, there is still this natural hedging effect. So you'd have laddering on standard service and then forecasts of the PPAs, which is at a point in time. It still shows that there is a natural hedging effect. So just intuitively to me, it makes sense to consider having that standard service rate change happen at the same time that the PPA rates change, as long as the PPAs are changing based on a forecast. And what we've seen is with the current process, those two things are by definition and by process entirely divorced from one another. So standard service rates are just changing. And then if there's a hedge, that hedge isn't being reflected until 16 months later. In the case of, I think it was 2022 or 23, now I've forgotten, the year when the standard service rates went through the roof and there was a large benefit still accruing for the MBFMCC. If you had the PPA rate change happen at that same time, there would have been a natural hedge based on the market forecast, not based on the credits that had accrued in the prior year. So long way of saying, I think that's our objective and intent is it does make some sense, although it's not standard service, it is power generation. So it's related in a customer's mind in some way to the generation. So there's some benefit to having customers understanding what's changing on July 1st and January 1st, at least for customers taking standard service. There's some benefit there, but there's also a benefit potentially in having there be a natural hedge that will help to avoid there being some double whammy.
So in the current process, as we've kind of established May, July, September, January as the 4 adjustments, then would it be, I guess, Eversource's position to, kind of similar to the current year annual RAM reviews, like we took January, February, March for May 1st. We, at that time, didn't take a forecast for the remainder of the year, but would it be Eversource's position to take a forecast at May 1st and then to look at it again, or is it more beneficial in order to align the standard service rates with the PPAs to just hold off on that first quarter of the year and do the forecast and those actuals all at once with July 1st?
I'm not sure if I'm following this scenario. I think what we're saying is that if the process is to stay as more aligned with what it is today, which PURA had, I think, well-intentioned when it changed the process after 2020, I don't disagree with the notion of having rates change on shoulder months. In fact, in Massachusetts, we just made that same proposal for our electric summer rate changes. Let's move it off to get it out of the summer, because that creates a whole another concern for customers when they're using electricity more and usage is driving high bills. So that, I totally agree with that wisdom. So there's a trade-off here, and that's why our comments are trying to kind of, present all options. If PURA's intent is to continue to have rates changing on shoulder months, meaning these RAM components May 1st and then September 1st or October 1st, as opposed to January or in July. The downside of having a July 1 rate change is then we're going to have another rate change right at the time that usage is increasing. So as I'm sitting here saying, hey, the PPAs make some good sense to me to change on January 1st and July 1st. I do believe that. There's also the potential unintended consequence that it could exacerbate customer confusion and concern on July 1st. So if PURA's intent on keeping the shoulder months, if that's, PURA's objective and priority, then I think what you're saying makes sense, that you'd have, our recommendation would be to have the May 1st rate change for the PPAs be updated to reflect January, February, and March, and have that be more of the automatic update, if you will, meaning that's going to have to come right before PURA approves the rate, just in terms of the calendar. We're going to know that, the first week of April, we're going to file it. It's going to have to get turned around very quickly. Our recommendation would be that PURA update for actual and forecast for the remainder of the year to take effect on May 1st each year. And then again, to have some other process. Our recommendation is to have a monthly monitoring process because we don't know how quickly it could become out of alignment. In UIs is to simply build in a set adjustment later in the year. And I think in either case the idea is like Tom said, we're trying to get to a place where just rates are staying in alignment. So I think either way could work.
Great, thank you. UI?
Getting the January through March actuals into a May 1st rate change, it would have to be absolutely limited to just the PPAs. And it'd be close because we may not get the generation until the middle of the month of April for March. So we're looking at doing a calculation just a couple of weeks before the rate has to go into effect. And that's going to be tough for the folks who have to do the calculation, and it's going to be tough for our billing department to do that. So it's probably really not feasible to get March actuals into a May 1st. And, that also then complicates not so that it's not solvable, but we still have to file all the other RAM components. So whatever we're filing for actuals for January through March would have to be separate from, or in addition to filing those actuals from the previous year and any known immeasurables or forecasts for our February 15th filing, which that in itself is a difficult filing to do because, all the documents that we use as sources to calculate the rates, they're still being built for a March 1st submission. So we're filing rates on February 15th, half a month before the data is formally available. And, that usually people have everything ready to go and just not formatted, but it just makes everything that much tighter. So that May 1st change, which we understand is because we didn't want to have increases happening during the summer months. But it does make for some logistical challenges. And we certainly don't like to have to do a rate filing on February 15th and then a revised rate filing on March 1st with the larger groups. If someone happens to notice that there's something that they missed sending us for that February 15th rate filing.
And if I could just add, in our initial comments back in March, we proposed to have one filing in the spring. And I want to recall it was March 15th to have one filing done March 15th that had all of the information in there rather than a January known and measurable, a February with information of rates but not complete information, and then a March 1 filing again.
Want to open up for OCC as well here, if there's anything you wanted to comment on.
Actually, I had some questions, I think. With the understanding, I think both companies have I won't call them proposals, have put forth ideas today that are attempting to cover the gamut of lots of different options. I think I heard maybe both companies suggest that one option with respect to the PPAs, one option could be to completely separate out the PPAs from NBFMCC for the purposes of rate adjustments and align those adjustments with the GSC adjustments in January and July. Is there an option where there is no May adjustment for the PPAs at all, and those costs are only adjusted January and July, and meaning the kind of no nuclear version of what gets filed in May just has no nuclear in it at all. It's just the entire remainder of the MBFMCC. Is that?
And I can start. There is, what we were thinking with that option is just like you're saying, you'd have the Millstone and Seabrook or the PPAs changing on January 1st and July 1st, and then everything else within the RAM goes May 1st on the track that it does now. But then, like I've said, I would expect there could be the need for a change at some point in the year, to the extent, especially for that January 1 rate change for the PPAs, if the forecast that we're relying on in December proves to be inaccurate. And we've seen that. I do want to be clear. We have seen that happen such that we would expect there could be a need that we meet our two-part trigger for the need for a rate change. May not have to happen on May 1st. It may not happen at all, but sorry, we wouldn't be expecting to need to build in a May 1st rate change for the PPAs, but we would want to then have that process where we're looking at it every month and saying, do we need to have a rate change to get things back on track?
And we would not, we would be looking to not, how do I say it? We would also be looking to have a January 1 rate change with the PPAs, not include that in the May filing, but we would prefer a standing second rate change, and that would be July 1 if we had a January 1 for the PPAs.
Attorney Will, can I just add one more thing and just talking about the January and July one and building that non-nuke MBFMCC rate, the MBFMCC 2.0, we would be using a much shorter line of sight in determining the forecast, right? So we're setting a rate on January 1 and July 1. We will be using a forecast only in that rate setting period through June 30th. And then, of course, at the time of the rate setting for January 1, like I indicated, we would have to take the prior 3 months as a forecast too. So you would have a rate setting process every 6 months that rolls in a new 9-month forecast and updates the last 6 months for actuals. So it's a little bit tighter than the current process in the RAM proceeding.
Thanks. And my follow-up question is sort of like what's intriguing to me about this, even absent the context of the PPAs at all, is the idea of a January adjustment conceptually better aligning with what we've discussed before in the RAM and a little bit here, the misalignment between the fact that under the current process, over/under recoveries are measured as of calendar year end, as opposed to like the rate period. And I understand that like all works itself out in the sauce with like the annual reconciliation. But is it the case that the January, like the filing for the PPAs alone for the January 1st adjustment, would that be more accurately reflective of actuals, like calendar year actuals than the current process? I know that you wouldn't have December 31st actuals to file. Like, I understand if we're changing rates on January 31st, that's not possible, but I guess would it be closer? Like, would you have a bigger chunk of the calendar year actuals to be looking at for that rate adjustment than you currently do? Does that question make sense?
I think so. For January 1, no, compared to May 1, but for July 1, yes. So your July 1 rate would essentially adjust for that and you would build it into your rate.
So I think we would have a better indication of what the end of year balance is going to be for those PPAs. So we'll just have to build the process to be able to include that. But right now, that balance doesn't get in until May 1st. So, I mean, there's something we could do there probably to
Yeah, so in
make
our,
that closer.
sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, so when we built the illustration, Attorney Wheel, we used a process that had been in place in the past where for the months of October, November, December, it would be a forecasted cost with compared to actual rates and revenue stream that are in place, actually in place, and then you would have your over under recovery. But as Mr. Kolka indicated, then you would get to your July 1, which would create a real over under recovery as of December 31 with actuals January, February, March. So now you're much tighter in your timeline where you're representing your revenues plus costs 3 months later, as opposed to the current RAM rate setting where we're only going through December 31 and you don't get to do a recast until the following year.
Thank you. I didn't have any statements, but thanks for the Thanks for letting me ask questions, even though I didn't ask them for permission to do so.
Oh, you're fine. Staying on the topic of standards, aligning with standard service, and I think Eversource, you kind of began to allude to this. But would the EDCs expect, and we can start with Eversource, that the changes to standard service established by Public Act 25-173 would impact any potential alignment between the nuclear PPAs and standard service rate changes?
My understanding is that process is still being finalized, so I don't know that we have great visibility into it. But like I said, my understanding is that the end result would result in more shorter term contracts potentially, or more real-time procurement, as opposed to the current practice, which relies upon laddering. And if you have laddering at various points, then we've shown here that you do have a natural hedging still. But the more those two things, meaning the procurement of standard service is aligned with the setting of the PPA rate, the more those two things are closer in time to one another, that's when I would expect you'd have that hedge to be more closely a hedge.
UI?
It'll definitely impact the RAM rates and that's being treated in another docket. But the question of where does the prudency review happen? If the prudency review from the new supply procurement happens in the RAM docket, then there'll have to be some serious redesigns that we're not anticipating or discussing right now, because that's out of scope of these comments. And it won't be in scope until we get a decision and direction on how to do there. Or if the prudency review is done in a different docket, then that will impact the RAM by pulling these cost streams and revenue streams out and putting those components in that other docket. So there's going to be a lot more work to come once that decision goes final on how to reconcile those rates and determine them.
Mr. Kolka, just to clarify, the prudency review that you're referring to in light of Public Act 25-173, is that referring to the prudency review of costs associated, the EDC costs associated with real-time purchases or self-supply?
Yeah, I believe eventually there'll be a need to do prudency reviews on that. Right now, the prudency review for the supply portion is done in the RAM docket, but the supply rates are not set in the RAM docket. So you have those being set in a different docket. The prudency review is being done in this docket. Any changes that result from the prudency review then get reflected in rates that are calculated in the procurement docket. That's probably going to continue, although it may be a different docket. It may not be YY0102 for UI, maybe something else, or maybe it isn't still in that docket. So, I mean, there's going to be impacts. We don't know what they look like right now, so it's out of scope for what we can say in this hearing, this technical meeting.
Understood. Thank you.
That's all I have at this time on this prompt. I don't know if anyone else has anything else before we move on. Okay. Then we'll move on to our fourth prompt on the topic of potential NBF MCC, SBC, and RDM cost allocation changes. My first questions are going to be for Eversource. I'll be referring to RRU 5 that the company had submitted just a couple days back. So it seems in RRU 5, among all the scenarios in Eversource's analysis that specifically rate 39 seems to be the outlier in each. Can Eversource provide an explanation as to why rate 39 would experience such a large impact if the scenarios were adopted?
Sure, I'm James Merjewski, team leader of Connecticut rates for Eversource. Rate 39 are very large industrial customers with higher than average load factors. So, as Mr. Kolka referred to earlier, if you have a demand rate or a demand allocator, if you have a high load factor being the relationship between demand and kilowatt hours. So if it's higher than average, you want a demand allocator and you want demand rates, you're better off. All right. On an energy allocator, it's going to favor those customers that have lower load factors. So, it's the same in all rates. So rate 39, large customers, high load factor, they're going to pay more on per kilowatt hour rates or rates that are allocated based on energy. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And does Eversource know how many customers fall under rate 39?
We have 7 customers.
How many was that?
7.
7. Does Eversource know what proportion of these customers make up the company's revenue share on the year?
Well, as a total revenue, you mean? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, a total revenue would be good.
Bear with me. So rate 39, based off of our latest July 1st filing, okay? On our summary page, we're at about $35.5 million for rate 39 on a total rate basis, okay? Out of a total of $5 billion, $5.1 billion.
Yeah.
I don't.
Got it. Thank you for that. So the implication for these customers, it seems based on RRU's filings, would be pretty significant. Obviously, if we adopted any of the cost allocation scenarios, we've talked about a type of phase-in process, 3-4 year phase-in.
Regardless, the rates still get to that total rate eventually.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the biggest, is the non-bypassable in the SBC.
Which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, looked like about a 10 or 11% total increase.
Right, yeah, if you want, we can, if case coordinator would oblige me to open up attachment 1 on data response to RU5 for Eversource.
It'll just be one quick moment.
Sure.
I guess as they're pulling that up, I'll ask UI a question on and understanding that UI we didn't request a new cost allocation methodology for the SBC, understanding that we went with the energy allocator there and UI is already doing that. I'm not sure there was anything to the degree of significance with some of your larger CNI customers in your analysis, right? It wasn't to that level of magnitude for any of your bigger customers. Is that right?
Well, there was no change for SBC, but for the non-bypassables under the different scenarios, yes, there. And you can see that in our PowerPoint presentation in the analysis. You can see in the appendix section, you can see a summary of what we filed for RRU5. And you can see that the more the allocation of energy is, the higher the bills will be for higher load factor customers. And our rate LPT is probably somewhat akin to Eversource's 39, although they have much more limited number of customers in that one. I mean, rate LPT is open to every large commercial and industrial customer. So we do have 400 or so customers in that. Some of them are not going to be the hugest of the huge, but that rate schedule is designed for customers who have higher load factors. And so you can see that the impacts by moving from demand-based, currently 1 CP, to energy is will increase those bills.
Thank you, Mr. Kolka. And back just to Eversource, I think you had asked for RRU attachment 1.
RU5
RU5
attachment
attachment
1. So let's start with, if you could go to page 5 of 31. Okay, so this is for the non-bypassable FMCC allocation. Non-bypassable FMCC is currently allocated for Eversource based on a 12 CP or demand allocator. The 3 scenarios were requested in data request RRU1, and what RRU5 is presenting here is the effect on a total bill basis for the changes between what the current allocation is and what it would be for each of the scenarios. Okay, and so we're, like I said, you're going from a true just based on demand, okay, monthly demands, versus a combination of demands, 1 CP, 12 CP, and energy, for the different components. And if you look down, rate 39, I realize it's small. It's listed as a line number, well, listed as line 43 there. And as you can see, you're looking at 10 to 11% on a total bill basis, not just a component, but total bill. So that that is very significant, for that component. A lot of the other charges, you're going to see, the residentials with a slight decline. And I would say in general, most of the C&I customers, all in that 1% range, and then starting to go up again when you get to our unmetered rates, rate 115, and then street lighting, 116 and 117. So now you're in that 2% range. And the same thing with our 3 special contract customers, which is rate 119.
So in reviewing both companies' responses, and I know, Mr. Kolka, you mentioned LPT. I was just taking a look at RRU 5 attachment 1 for UI for the LPT standard service scenario. And I'm seeing for the NBFMCC scenarios, if I take the average of them all, closer to like a 1.23% total bill impact for those larger LPT customers. So I'm curious why. I know, Eversource indicated that you had 7 customers in rate 39. And of course, the rates I'm sure have differences, but, versus the LPT rate at 400 customers, wondering what's the driver and why you're seeing rate 39 show like a 10% increase due to the changes to the NBFMCC allocators versus UI's larger CNI customers aren't necessarily seeing that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that if we were to segregate these customers out individually, that those large customers with higher load factors, remember, this is at the class average. There's going to be customers above the average and below the class average. I think that you find that individual bill impacts for those customers above the class average probably could approach that. I haven't looked at each individual bill, but this is just from a class average. So there'll be some that are a little more and some that are less. But someone who has a load factor of 80% is going to really pay a lot with an energy amount.
And I think the other, rate 39, again, is for interruptible customers. So a lot of times they are interrupting at time of peak, which is lowering their demand, and then kind of running their whatever they need to run outside of that. So their demand is lower than a lot of the customers because they are interrupting it. And then you still have, running 3 shifts or everything else associated with it to get a very high load factor, again, manufacturing customers. So I think that's another part of this.
Okay, so is it possible that because there's a smaller number of customers under rate 39 and potentially the fact that their load factors could be on average significantly much higher than the average of, say, LPT customers with UI, that could be the driver?
I would say so, yeah.
Got it. Okay, but that was helpful. I'm gonna move on to, unless anyone else has any clarifier questions. I was gonna go to the RDM. Just a question for both companies. If splitting the RDM, I know initially with the scenarios presented, we looked at tracking the over/under recoveries by individual rate classes for the RDM, and what that produced was a lot of rate change all over the place for each individual rate class. But for RRU 5, we asked to split the over/under collection balances between residential and C&I customers. Does the companies have any opinion on whether that scenario is more equitable to ratepayers versus what's currently the way we're currently just applying, the energy allocator across the board?
Yes. If you could go, if you could bring up that same attachment 1 on page 1 of 31. Private source, thank you. So, as you stated, the RDM is currently set up on an energy allocator. Every rate class pays the same charge, okay? For the last period, Eversource under collected. So, there's going to be a positive charge to customers' bills. It can go in both directions. It's lately has been under collecting, but it could also over collect. So we've under collected. We need to collect additional dollars from rate classes. And so on the average races, everyone pays the same thing. They're all, making up that difference, kind of socialized across everybody. With the scenario where the overcollection is parsed into the residential block versus everybody else, the residential block would actually have a decrease in rate, even though we're in an under-collected situation. And all the other C&I class customers are all paying, additionally. And realize, again, allocation, when you're doing allocations, the total amount of the expense has already been decided. So when you drop the rate for one class, somebody else is picking that up. In this case, it's the C&I customers, right? So you got it. And, we've stated in our response to RU1, and we've stated actually for all of our, for all of these scenarios, what our, comments are, it's on the record. But, having a situation where the overall rate is dropping and then having a negative or a credit, for some customers and a charge to others, I don't think the company just, would not support that. I don't think it's a reasonable situation or a fair situation, especially since, what we're using to look at whether or not they've over or under collected on a rate class basis is based off of a forecast that was done for a number of years ago, based off of, what built up, the amount of distribution revenue that needed to be collected. So, trying to parse it further, into these two different buckets, or as we tried to earlier, into individual buckets, getting these inherent problems and, having one class against another class, a negative versus a positive, when your overall price or overall expense needs to be increasing.
Any comments there, UI, on equitability on a structure like this?
No, rate design is always done on a revenue neutral basis, even if you are in a rate case and rates are going to increase. The rate design aspect of it is always done revenue neutral. And so if someone is going to pay more under a new rate design than they were, they're not going to like that. And if someone is going to pay less under a new rate design, well, then they're going to say, I should have been paying less the whole time. There's no way to win in a rate design situation. People are always going to not like it. But the reality is costs change over time. So rates have to be, rate allocations change over time and rate designs change over time. So there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. If the objective is to have costs that have rates that are based strictly on cost causation, there's going to be dissatisfaction, at least until customers get used to the new rates. And that's always going to be the case, whether it's above or below. So the question then is, do we do it? Do we even do rate design? And if so, I think we need to make sure that what we're doing is logical and what we're doing is also coordinated across all the other rate components, because we could go to a higher energy rate over here. That's going to increase the rates to high load factor customers. But you may have distribution rates that ideally should be all based on demand, and yet there are energy components in that. So those high load factor customers, they're not going to see a rate design benefit there unless we do something there. So we do a rate design for an individual component. The effect is not isolated to that component. The effect is on their bill. You can show a change just based on that component, but so it really should be looked at now holistically. What does this do to the entire rate schema? And by looking at just the RDM, then it kind of muddies the water when it comes to allocation for distribution, because this is a distribution phenomena. And it's always, since day one, it was done at the beginning just because it was new and nobody really knew what to do with it back in 2009, 2010. That's why we went to the one-size-fits-all energy allocation. Here, I don't know if this really is a significant improvement over that by just splitting it to residential and non-residential. And we also have a problem in that, what do you do with the other revenues? Because the other revenues are also subject, are part of the decoupling calculation. And there's not any good way to allocate a lot of these other revenues, because they're not specifically residential or non-residential related. Pole attachments, they're not residential or non-residential. They're just total company. So what I did in this was I just split all those other revenues up in the same proportion that the revenues were split up for residential and non-residential. So we have to come to grips with that. I mean, that's easy to do mechanically. Is that right? I'm not entirely sure, but I don't know what we could do otherwise. And there is a little bit of a challenge to UIs, to the numbers you see on UIs here, because we are now in a credit range for RDM. So it's going exactly opposite as it would if it was a debit. And as Mr. Majerski said, it can go either way. So when we do this change, we have to realize that if you allocate more expense to a particular group, then they're going to get a higher RDM charge. But in the case where the RDM is a credit, they're going to get a higher RDM credit. So we just have to be aware of that too.
Thank you. I have a couple of clarifying questions. I want to get to the NBFMCC. But just really quick, maybe a quick answer. I think OCC's position on the RDM is to maintain the energy allocator altogether without any allocation change. Is that right?
Sorry, Ben Havamaki for OCC. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Just as a time check, we think we have maybe about 10 more minutes-ish of discussion. So with the commissioner's allowance to go over the anticipated 1 p.m. time slot, I just wanted to make that known. Okay.
Okay, just a couple questions on specifically scenario 3 of the NBFMCC cost allocation that the companies had provided in RRU 5 and RRU 1. Just clarifying question, I think for UI, you had alluded to it, that in that scenario that was prescribed, you updated to a 12 CP cost allocator for the New England grid grid costs, and then for the other and mandated energy purchase category, you maintain a 1 CP for contract for differences. Is that what I heard?
Yes, that was our proposal.
Okay. And then I guess for Eversource, would that be the same in your scenario, that it was primarily just the contract for differences that it was applied to, the 1 CP or 12 CP in that scenario? What was specifically used?
Give me 1 second. Our support person for there is out in the hallway for a second, and hopefully coming right back in. If I could, I don't know if there's other questions, we can get back to it.
Sure. I guess in general, would being consistent between the New England grid operator costs, and if we went with scenario 3 where there's that demand allocator being maintained for things like contract for differences, does it make sense to stay consistent 12 CP, 12 CP, or does it make sense to 12 CP, 1 CP for those specific contracts? Why or why not? I can restate it at some point. Yeah, sure. We can come back to the question on the other mandated energy, 1 CP, and
So, as outlined in RU1, Part A, the 1 CP was only for contracts for differences. The remaining expenses were energy.
thank you.
Energy allocator. Thank you. Sorry.
Got it. Thank you for that. And then to my second question, which I'll restate for Eversource and UI, would it make sense if the New England grid operator costs are at 12 CP to keep that consistent for these other mandated energy costs to remain at 12 CP, or to keep the contract for differences at a 1 CP? Why or why not?
The company does not use the 1 CP at all at this point. If we're using a demand allocator, we're using the 12 CP. Right? If we're using an energy allocator, we're using energy. So we're not using a 1 CP whatsoever. Going to the 1 CP just for, this little variance, where do you stop when you start doing some of that?
Okay.
So, I think we would advocate for just using a 12 CP, for all demand related expense.
So we propose these based on what we think the proper cost allocators are. Now, this is just maybe a purist look at this, but we know that the New England grid operator costs are assigned to the company based on monthly network load, and that's 12 CP. That's how ISO New England bills these costs out to the utilities. The contracts for differences, those were implemented in the late 2000s to attack the peaking issue. And these are for peaking plants. The 1 CP allocator was traditionally used to allocate the capacity costs of peaking plants back in bundled days. So that's why we thought it was appropriate if we were to have an ideal allocator, that is. Remember, this is just ideal allocation, that the contracts for differences, which are identifiable and separable in the on Exhibit F. You can see those line items, that those were intended to attack the peak generation problem. So that's why we used it there. Now, the rest of the state mandated energy purchases, and the lion's share of those, of course, are the nuclear plants. Well, that's energy generation. And that is classic energy fuel allocation. So that's why we proposed those as we did.
Thank you. I just have one last question for the OCC in regards to RRU 5. Just curious what OCC's reactions are to the bill impacts for each scenario across the mechanisms and the EDC's responses. And then maybe one follow-up once I get your first answer.
Ben Havamaki for OCC. I think we don't have any very specific response to any of the individual scenarios, except to sort of stick to the high-level principles about kind of, contemplating overall impacts. And I think, we don't have like very granular specific feedback. I think, the fact that a change in the direction of cost causality may adversely affect a particular rate class, in an outsized way, shouldn't militate against making that change. It's just a question of, from a holistic perspective, taking stock of all the other effects, how to do that in a gradual way.
So OCC does support where it might merit a phased-in approach, where it was merited for a change, for cost causation or, equitable reasons to phase that in for some of those ratepayers who might ultimately get hurt the most.
I think to put a finer point on it, those results don't alter the recommendations that we made for allocation in the March comments. So the fact that there may be, adverse effects on, in the direction of ultimate equity, doesn't, it's not ultimately, it doesn't ultimately result in us changing our recommendations for allocation. It's just more of an implementation question.
Yeah, and I can add, this might just be repeating what Ben just said, but I think from our perspective, it's important to consider in rate design whether there are winners and losers, but it's also to consider the current, I think respectfully in response to some of what the companies have said, it sounds like their comments are based on the supposition that the current allocation methodology is a perfect rate design. So like we would be concerned conceptually if we had a perfect current rate design about any kind of adjustment that would result in extreme swings one way or the other, because we'd have concerns about any adjustment at all if we were already perfect. But I think I guess another way of saying that is if there is a remarkable impact on a particular rate class, that's certainly worthy of attention. But that, I think, just the remarkable impact in isolation doesn't necessarily have to be the only reason not to move forward if the remarkable impact is necessary in order to correct the overall allocation methodology. And yeah, and to get to the more specific question, that said, we definitely agree with the principle of gradualism. I don't know if we have a particular position on the amount of time a phase-in would be necessary, but a phase-in makes sense, I think, under any circumstance where there's a substantial adjustment to the overall rate impact.
Good. Thank you.
All right, that's brings us to the end of the agenda that we had prepared for today, unless there are any other comments that folks would like to make regarding the RAM process modifications under consideration here today. Attorney Bidra?
Yes, please. Good afternoon. My comment is related to the schedule as set forth. If the commissioners would like to say a few words about that first, or if you would permit me to comment on what has already been set forth.
Thank you. We don't have anything to elaborate on beyond the published schedule, so we're open to your comment.
Thank you. And let me start by thanking the authority for this opportunity today to discuss these very important issues. The company appreciates it. So my comment is on the currently slated September 4th brief. Today, we've discussed a number of different dates to set PPA costs. We've discussed different ways to have a potential threshold. And if the company were to submit a brief, which we are happy to do by September 4th, it would largely be a reiteration of the two sets of comments that we've already submitted. So in thinking about how to make the brief more meaningful to the authority, we would be very much appreciative if the authority could hone in perhaps on the different sets of proposals and ideas that have been set forth in comments in here today, something like a straw proposal, and then the company could more meaningfully react to that.
Thank you for your comment, Attorney Bidra. I think we're gonna have to take that under advisement. We do not currently contemplate providing a straw proposal in this matter, but if we can certainly take it under advisement about providing more targeted briefing prompts. So if the authority elects to do that, it would publish those briefing prompts in the docket.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further from anyone?
And nothing further. We were just going to reiterate the date for the brief, which was the next event in the schedule.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for everyone's active participation, not just today, but in providing responses to the written comments as well as the interrogatories along the way. And I stay tuned to the docket. Thank you, and we are adjourned.